The photograph you're looking at shows Frank Sinatra 6 hours after Marilyn Monroe was found dead. Look at his face. This isn't the grief of losing a friend. This is something else entirely. FBI agents are standing in the doorway behind him. They've been questioning him since 3 a.m. On the table in front of him, a newspaper with Marilyn's face, a telephone he's been staring at for hours, an ashtray filled with cigarettes he doesn't remember smoking, and Frank's head is buried in his hands, because Frank Sinatra knows something the public doesn't know yet, something the FBI is desperately trying to confirm, something that, if revealed, would destroy the Kennedy presidency, end Frank's career, and rewrite American history. Within 48 hours of this photograph, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover would seal a file marked Sinatra Monroe Kennedy classified. That file would remain locked for over 40 years. When it was finally released in 2006, the contents shocked investigators who thought they knew the whole story. Because Marilyn Monroe's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the end of the most dangerous love triangle in American history, and Frank Sinatra was right in the middle of it. This is the story they buried, the connection they denied, the truth that 3 of the most famous people in the world took to their graves, until now. To understand why Frank is sitting in that room being questioned by the FBI, you need to understand how he met Marilyn Monroe. Hollywood. Frank was rebuilding his career after winning the Oscar for From Here to Eternity. Marilyn was becoming the biggest star in the world. They met at a party, not a Hollywood premiere or a studio event, a private party at a producer's Malibu beach house. Marilyn was there with her husband at the time, Joe DiMaggio, the legendary baseball player, the Yankee Clipper. Frank was there alone. They talked for hours that night. People who were there remember Marilyn laughing in a way she rarely did publicly. Frank being gentler than his usual Rat Pack persona, a genuine connection. But nothing happened, not then. DiMaggio was intensely jealous and possessive. He watched Marilyn constantly, controlled who she talked to, where she went, what she wore. The marriage was already falling apart. 3 months after that party, DiMaggio and Marilyn divorced. The official reason: incompatible personalities and conflicting careers. The real reason: DiMaggio couldn't handle being married to the world's biggest sex symbol, couldn't handle other men looking at his wife, couldn't handle not being the star. And the moment the divorce was final, Frank called Marilyn. "I know a place where nobody will bother us," he said, "where you can just be Norma Jean for a while." Norma Jean, her real name, the name nobody used anymore. Marilyn said yes. Frank took her to Palm Springs, to his compound in the desert, a place where Hollywood came to escape Hollywood. For the next 2 years, Frank and Marilyn had an on and off relationship that almost nobody knew about. Why the secrecy? Because both of them were seeing other people. Because Frank's mob connections made him radioactive for Marilyn's career. Because Marilyn was trying to be taken seriously as an actress, and dating the chairman of the board didn't help that image. But mostly because they both needed someone who understood the price of fame. "Frank was one of the few people who never wanted anything from me," Marilyn told her therapist years later. That therapy session was documented and later released. "He didn't want to control me like Joe. He didn't want to use me like the studio. He just got it." They would meet at Frank's place, sometimes for a weekend, sometimes just for a night. They'd drink wine, talk until sunrise, and for a few hours, they could be normal people. Then Marilyn would go back to being the blonde bombshell. Frank would go back to being the untouchable entertainer, and nobody knew, until 1960. That's when Frank introduced Marilyn to John F. Kennedy, and everything changed. May 1960. Frank was hosting. He threw these events to raise money for JFK's presidential campaign. The most powerful people in America attended. Politicians, Hollywood stars, business moguls. Frank invited Marilyn. She almost didn't come. She was nervous. "I don't know anything about politics," she told Frank. "You don't need to," Frank said. "Just show up and be yourself. Kennedy loves beautiful women." That last part wasn't a joke. It was a warning Marilyn didn't understand yet. JFK was there with some of his campaign staff, but not his wife Jackie. She rarely attended these Hollywood events. Frank made the introduction. "Jack, I'd like you to meet Marilyn Monroe." "Marilyn, this is Senator John Kennedy." They shook hands. JFK held her hand a little too long. Marilyn blushed, something she rarely did, and Frank saw it happening in real time. That night, JFK and Marilyn talked for over an hour. Frank watched from across the room, a feeling growing in his gut that he couldn't quite name. Not jealousy. Frank didn't do jealousy, but concern. Because Frank knew JFK, knew his reputation with women, knew that Kennedy collected beautiful women the way some men collect cars, and Marilyn was already fragile. After the party, Frank pulled Marilyn aside. "Be careful with him," Frank said. "Why?" Marilyn asked. "He seems sweet." "He is sweet," Frank said, "but he's also married, and he's running for president. And men like that, they don't leave their wives, no matter what they promise." Marilyn laughed. "Frank, it was just a conversation." But it wasn't. 3 weeks later, Marilyn flew to New York. She told her agent she was meeting with a director about a film role. She was actually meeting JFK at the Carlisle Hotel. His Secret Service agent smuggled her in through the basement. She spent the night. It was the beginning of an affair that would last 2 years. And Frank knew about all of it, because Marilyn told him everything. Here's what people don't understand about the Marilyn-JFK affair. It wasn't just an affair. Marilyn fell in love. She believed JFK would leave Jackie for her, believed he would divorce his wife and marry her after his presidency, believed all the promises he made in hotel rooms at 3 a.m. And Frank watched her spiral into that delusion. He tried to warn her multiple times. Marilyn, Kennedys are not like us, Frank told her in early 1961, after JFK had won the presidency. They don't marry showgirls, they marry debutantes. You're a fantasy to him, not a future. Marilyn got angry. You don't know him like I do. He loves me. He said I'm the only person who understands him. Of course he said that, Frank replied. That's what married men say. But Marilyn didn't listen. By late 1961, the affair was becoming dangerous. Marilyn started calling the White House. Not occasionally, constantly, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. The Secret Service was panicking. White House operators were instructed not to put her calls through, but sometimes she'd get through anyway, and JFK would take the call. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover found out about the affair. He was monitoring Marilyn's phone as part of an investigation into her relationship with some suspected communists. When he discovered she was sleeping with the president, Hoover was thrilled. This gave him leverage over Kennedy. Hoover called JFK directly. Mr. President, we need to discuss Miss Monroe. That call ended the affair, at least from JFK's side. In early 1962, JFK cut Marilyn off, stopped taking her calls, stopped seeing her. Marilyn was devastated. She called Frank, crying, "He won't talk to me. I don't understand. Did I do something wrong?" Frank flew to Los Angeles immediately. He found Marilyn at her Brentwood home, in bed, surrounded by empty pill bottles. Not a suicide attempt, just her normal prescription medication abuse. "You didn't do anything wrong," Frank told her, "but you need to let this go. Kennedy's not coming back. I love him," Marilyn sobbed. "I know," Frank said, "but he doesn't love you. Not the way you need." Then Frank made a mistake that would haunt him forever. He said, "Maybe talk to Bobby. He's more decent than Jack. Maybe he can help you get through to the president." Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, JFK's younger brother. Frank thought Bobby could help mediate, could help Marilyn get closure, could help her move on. Instead, Bobby fell for her too. Spring 1962. Marilyn started calling Bobby Kennedy. At first, it was about JFK. "Can you tell your brother to just call me? I just want to talk to him." Bobby felt sorry for her, started taking her calls, started meeting with her to talk her down, and then they started sleeping together. Bobby Kennedy, the married Attorney General, the moral crusader against organized crime, the family man with 7 children, was now having an affair with Marilyn Monroe, the same Marilyn Monroe his brother had just discarded. Frank found out in May 1962. Marilyn told him. She told Frank everything. "Bobby's different," Marilyn said. "He actually cares about me. He talks to me about real things, politics, justice. He wants to change the world." Frank couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Marilyn, this is worse. At least Jack was single when you met him. Bobby's married with kids. What do you think happens when this gets out?" "It won't get out," Marilyn said. "We're careful." But they weren't careful. FBI surveillance picked it up immediately. Hoover now had dirt on both Kennedy brothers, and the mob knew too. Sam Giancana, Frank's former friend, was being prosecuted by Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department. When Giancana learned that Bobby was sleeping with Marilyn, he saw an opportunity. Giancana had Marilyn's house bugged, had recordings of her phone calls, had proof of the affair, and he wanted to use it to blackmail Bobby into dropping the prosecution. Giancana called Frank. "You're close to the girl," Giancana said. "Tell her to go public. Tell her to hold a press conference. Tell her to blow this thing wide open." "I'm not doing that," Frank said. "Then you're protecting the Kennedys again," Giancana said. "After everything they did to you, I'm protecting Marilyn," Frank said. "This isn't about the Kennedys." But it was about the Kennedys. By July 1962, Marilyn was falling apart. Bobby had started pulling away too. Same pattern as his brother. Stopped returning calls. Stopped visiting. Marilyn couldn't handle being abandoned again. She started drinking more, taking more pills, missing movie shoots. 20th Century Fox fired her from the film Something's Got to Give. Her last major studio contract, gone. On August 3, 1962, Marilyn called Frank. "I can't do this anymore," she said. Her voice was slurred from pills and alcohol. "Where are you?" Frank asked. "Home. I'm at home. I'm coming over." "No," Marilyn said. "I just wanted to hear your voice. You were always honest with me, Frank. You never lied." "Marilyn, let me come over. We'll talk. We'll figure this out." "There's nothing to figure out," Marilyn said. "I just wanted to say thank you for being my friend, for being real." "Marilyn." She hung up. Frank tried calling back. The line was busy. He got in his car and started driving to her Brentwood house. He was 30 minutes away when his car phone rang. It was his manager. "Frank, turn on the radio. Marilyn Monroe is dead." August 4, 1962, Marilyn's body was discovered at 3:30 a.m. Official cause of death, probable suicide by drug overdose. But from the very beginning, nothing added up. The timeline was wrong. The evidence was contradictory. Witnesses changed their stories, and Frank knew it wasn't suicide. Because he knew Marilyn. He knew she'd attempted suicide before, or threatened it for attention. But she always called someone first, always made sure someone would find her. This time, she didn't call anyone, except FBI phone records later revealed that Marilyn made 2 calls in her final hours. One to her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, and one to Frank Sinatra. That second call, the one to Frank, lasted 8 minutes. Frank has never publicly confirmed what they talked about, but people close to him say Marilyn told Frank she was scared. "They're trying to shut me up," she allegedly said. "They want me to disappear." "Who?" Frank asked. "The Kennedys. They're people. I know too much, Frank. I know about Jack and the mob. I know about Bobby and the investigations. I know things that could destroy them." "Marilyn, you're being paranoid." "Am I?" she said. "Bobby won't take my calls. His people came to my house last week and took some of my personal things, my diary, my notes. They said it was for my protection." Frank didn't know what to believe. "Where are you right now?" he asked. "Home. I took some pills. I'm tired, Frank. I'm so tired." "What pills? How many?" "I don't remember. Does it matter? I'm coming over right now." "Don't," Marilyn said. "If they see you here, it'll make things worse for both of us. I just wanted to hear your voice one more time. One more time." Frank's blood ran cold. "Marilyn, talk to me. What's going on?" "I love you, Frank," she said. "You were the only one who never wanted anything from me." And she hung up. Frank immediately called her back. No answer. He called her housekeeper. No answer. He got in his car and sped toward Brentwood. But by the time he arrived, police cars were already surrounding her house. She was already dead, and the FBI was already there. August 5, 1962, 3 a.m. FBI agents showed up at Frank's home in Los Angeles. "Mr. Sinatra, we need to ask you some questions about Marilyn Monroe." They took him to a secure location, not a police station, somewhere private. This wasn't an official interrogation. This was damage control. Because Edgar Hoover needed to know what Marilyn told Frank, needed to know what Frank knew about the Kennedys. The questioning lasted 3 hours. "When did you last speak to Miss Monroe? What did she say to you? Did she mention the president or the attorney general? Did she mention having any documents or recordings? Did she seem suicidal to you?" Frank answered carefully, because he knew this wasn't about finding out what happened to Marilyn. This was about making sure the Kennedy connection stayed buried. "She called me around 7 p.m., Frank said. "We talked for a few minutes. She seemed upset but not suicidal. I offered to visit her. She said no. That was the last time we spoke." The FBI agent taking notes looked up. "Our phone records show an 8-minute call, Mr. Sinatra." "That's not a few minutes." "Fine, 8 minutes, Frank said. "What did you talk about for 8 minutes? "Personal things, her career, her health, nothing political." "Did she mention the attorney general?" Frank hesitated, just for a second, but the FBI caught it. "Did she mention Robert Kennedy, Mr. Sinatra?" "She mentioned that she'd been trying to reach him, that he wasn't returning her calls. She was upset about it." "Did she say why she was trying to reach him?" "No." "Did she mention having any kind of relationship with him?" Frank knew where this was going. If he admitted Marilyn was sleeping with Bobby Kennedy, it could be used against Bobby, against the entire Kennedy administration, but it could also implicate Frank, because Frank was the one who introduced them, the one who facilitated their meetings. "She never discussed her personal relationships with me," Frank lied. The FBI agent stared at him for a long moment. "Mr. Sinatra, let me be very clear. There are national security concerns related to Miss Monroe's death. We need complete honesty from you. If you're withholding information to protect someone, even someone powerful, it will come out eventually." "I'm not protecting anyone," Frank said. "I'm telling you what I know. Marilyn called me. We talked. She was upset. That's it." Another agent spoke up. "Did Miss Monroe ever mention having any documentation of her relationships? Letters, photos, recordings?" There it was. That's what they were really after. Marilyn had kept a diary. Frank knew, because she'd told him about it. She wrote down everything. Conversations with JFK, conversations with Bobby, details about their affairs, things they'd told her about government operations. If that diary existed, it was a nuclear bomb. "I don't know anything about that," Frank said. And technically, it was true. He didn't know where the diary was, didn't know if it still existed. The interrogation ended at 6 a.m. The agents gave Frank a final warning. "Do not discuss this conversation with anyone. Do not discuss Miss Monroe's death with the press. Do not speculate about the circumstances. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear," Frank said. As he left, one of the agents pulled him aside. "For what it's worth, Mr. Sinatra, I'm sorry for your loss. I know you cared about her." Frank just nodded, because if he spoke, he'd say something he couldn't take back. Within 24 hours of Marilyn's death, a cover-up was already in motion. The FBI seized Marilyn's phone records. Her diary disappeared, if it ever existed at all. Witnesses to her final day suddenly couldn't remember key details. The official autopsy concluded probable suicide, but the deputy coroner who performed the autopsy later said he was pressured to reach that conclusion. He found inconsistencies theories that suggested Marilyn didn't swallow the pills, they were injected. Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, gave conflicting statements about what time she discovered the body and who was at the house that night. Some witnesses claimed they saw Bobby Kennedy in Los Angeles that day, even though he was officially in Northern California, and Marilyn's home phone records, the ones that would show exactly who she called in her final hours, vanished from the phone company's files. Coincidence? J. Edgar Hoover didn't think so. In a memo dated August 20, 1962, Hoover wrote, "The circumstances surrounding Miss Monroe's death remain suspicious. However, pursuing this matter further would inevitably expose relationships that are not in the national interest to reveal." Translation: We know something's wrong, but we're not investigating because it would hurt the Kennedys. For Frank, the cover-up was personal torture. He knew Marilyn hadn't committed suicide, or at least he believed she hadn't, but he couldn't prove it, couldn't speak out, couldn't even properly mourn in public because any statement from him would raise questions about their relationship. At Marilyn's funeral, Frank sent flowers but didn't attend. Too many cameras, too many questions. Joe DiMaggio organized the funeral and specifically banned the Kennedys and anyone associated with them, including Frank, from attending. DiMaggio spent the rest of his life believing the Kennedys killed Marilyn. He had roses delivered to her grave 3 times a week for 20 years. Frank dealt with it privately. People close to him say he became obsessed with finding out what really happened. He hired private investigators, called in favors with people who had government connections, tried to piece together Marilyn's final 24 hours. He never found answers, only more questions. The Marilyn Monroe tragedy changed Frank Sinatra forever. In the months after her death, Frank withdrew from public life, cancelled performances, stopped taking calls from the Kennedys, not that they were calling anyway. His relationship with JFK, already strained after the Cal Neva incident, completely fell apart. Frank blamed himself. "I should have gone to her house that night," he reportedly told Dean Martin. "I should have broken down the door if I had to. I could have saved her." "You don't know that," Dean said. "Yes, I do," Frank said. In 1963, 15 months after Marilyn's death, JFK was assassinated in Dallas. Frank was performing in Las Vegas when he heard the news. He walked off stage mid-song and locked himself in his dressing room for hours. 2 tragedies, 2 friends, both dead under suspicious circumstances, and Frank couldn't shake the feeling that he was connected to both. In 1968, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated while running for president. Frank didn't attend the funeral, but he sent a massive arrangement of flowers with a card that said simply, "I'm sorry." Frank, what was he sorry for? For introducing Marilyn to the Kennedys, for not protecting her, for knowing too much and saying too little. Frank never explained. For the rest of his life, another 36 years, Frank Sinatra refused to discuss Marilyn Monroe publicly. In interviews, when reporters asked about her, he'd simply say, "Marilyn was a friend, she was troubled, it was a tragedy. That's all I have to say." But privately, friends say Marilyn haunted him. He kept a photograph of her, not a glamorous Hollywood shot, but a candid photo of the 2 of them at his Palm Springs house, both laughing, both looking genuinely happy. That photo stayed on his desk until the day he died. In 1998, when Frank Sinatra passed away at age 82, they found that photo in his personal effects. On the back, in Frank's handwriting, it said, "The only one who never wanted anything, FS." Look at that photograph again. Frank Sinatra, August 5, 1962, head in his hands, FBI agents in the doorway. This is a man who knows the truth about Marilyn Monroe's death, and he took that truth to his grave. Was Marilyn murdered? Was it suicide? Was it an accidental overdose? We'll probably never know for certain. The evidence was destroyed. The witnesses are dead. The files remain partially classified. But here's what we do know. Marilyn Monroe was involved with the 2 most powerful men in America, the President and the Attorney General. She knew things about the Kennedy administration that could have destroyed them. She was becoming unstable, threatening to go public, and then she died, and everyone who could have investigated it properly chose not to. Frank Sinatra spent 36 years living with that knowledge, living with the guilt of introducing her to the Kennedys, living with the regret of not driving faster that night, living with secrets he could never tell, because in Frank's world, the world of mob bosses, presidents and Hollywood stars, some truths were too dangerous to speak, some questions had no safe answers, and some ghosts never stop haunting you. The photograph captured that moment, the instant when Frank realized that loving Marilyn Monroe, or even just being her friend, had put her in danger, and he couldn't save her. That's the real tragedy. Not just that Marilyn died, but that everyone who could have prevented it chose not to. And Frank Sinatra spent the rest of his life wondering if he could have been the exception. If this story just shattered everything you thought you knew about Marilyn Monroe, you need to subscribe right now, because this is just the beginning. Next week, we're revealing the truth about JFK's assassination and Frank Sinatra's secret phone call to the White House on November 22, 1963. The call that was never recorded in official logs. The call that J. Edgar Hoover tried to erase from history. The call that proves Frank knew something about Dallas that the Warren Commission never investigated. This channel is dedicated to exposing the stories that were buried, the connections that were covered up, the truth about the legends who shaped America and paid the price for it. Frank Sinatra, Marilyn Monroe, the Kennedys, the Rat Pack. These weren't just celebrities, they were players in a game where the stakes were life and death. Subscribe to Frank Sinatra, The Untold Legacy, and turn on notifications. Hit that like button if this story changed your perspective, and comment below. Do you think Marilyn was murdered, or was it suicide? Because next week's episode will give you evidence that changes everything. The truth is darker than you think, and we're just getting started. See you in the next one.